Is the law ready for driverless cars?
Oh, not by a long way, Kat. The issues that driverless car raise for the regulators are far more complex than the kinds of issues that are currently dealt with in regulation. You've got coordination between state and federal law, you've got basic challenges regarding the kinds of standards that will apply to this new technology and how those standards will be regulated. And then at the core of it, the one that keeps coming up no matter who you ask and where the question's being considered is, what about the laws that say the driver is a person, and when the driver becomes a robot, how do you regulate that, and what rules should apply to traffic accidents and to interactions between humans and robots on the road, and what rules should apply when you're at some stage of creating driverless cars and you've got some autonomy but some driver control. So these things are very complex, and the rules about how they're going to work have not been formulated properly.
What work is being done in relation to driverless cars overseas?
Well, one of the trials that's closest to home is in Singapore. The Singaporean government has arranged for a company called Nautonomy to provide driverless technology which has been mounted on the top of electric Mitsubishi cars. And they're trialling that as a taxi service within Singapore. Only today, the Singaporean competitor, or the Asian competitor to Uber, a company called Grab, announced that they were participating in that trial. At the moment, there's somebody sitting behind the steering wheel monitoring and keeping the car safe, but the intention is to run automated vehicles as taxis in Singapore. There's also a big trial on in Pittsburgh where Uber are sponsoring a similar project where vehicles are being used for public transport. Their aim is to develop a driverless solution which doesn't need them to have drivers drive Ubers. And that's been quite controversial. There's been a little bit of press lately that they've gone ahead with the trialling of the vehicles without putting any rules in place as to exactly what the technologies are and how the technologies should be regulated. But Pittsburgh were prepared to give it a go, and that's a major trial. There's also a number of trials. There's one trial in Australia where they're doing buses in Perth. The NRMA is working on using driverless buses for some of its people in Sydney. That's an early stage project. There's another one in Sweden, and there are a number of trials in Germany, so it's really happening.
As we transition to a driverless world, what are the legal challenges associated with that crossover period where drivers and driverless cars are going to be sharing the roads?
Well, everybody's talking about a sort of 5-step standard that exists for one of the international standards bodies, and at step 1 there's driver control, and at step 5 there's robotic control. And in between there are the various stages of responsibility passing between the driver and the robot. So the question becomes, when do you make one responsible, and when is it reasonable really to say that the driver is still in control of the car when in fact it's the robot who's got most of the responsibility for steering and management. And also it depends a lot on what the robot's capable of doing and whether or not the driver's been trained properly to understand when he should turn it off and when he should take control and when the circumstances are not appropriate for the robot. So these things are all very complex. In the recent consultation that was run by the National Transport Commission here in Australia, the submissions on that just kind of said too early to tell. We don't know whether you should sort of mandate that the maker of the machinery has responsibility, or you should always have the driver have control. We have to work that out as these systems develop and the controls develop around them.
As we transition to driverless cars, what role is there for the driver to play?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. If you're Google, Google came out early and said, look, these cars ought to be autonomous. The drivers cause the problem, and the integration between the driver and the car is more challenging than just building a good automated vehicle that's safe. The accidents that have happened with autopilots, and a recent one that was suffered by Tesla, happened because the driver, apparently anyway, wasn't paying attention to the road and wasn't able to take over in time. But I also heard a story that with one of these early autopilot automations, the vendor had to pull back the software pretty quickly because people were going to sleep in the back when they should have been sitting at the steering wheel paying attention to the road. So that question of how you do it realistically, where you sort of make a transition from partial automation to fully automation, is really challenging and probably the hardest question. There's also this question of behaviour on the road. If you've got some automated vehicles and some people on the road, then what's to stop the people deciding to push the automated vehicles out of the way? Playing some gamesmanship with the way these vehicles will behave defensively to protect their passengers. And that sort of antisocial behaviour will need to be sort of predicted and regulated, and the way that we work with vehicles when there are both humans and automated vehicles really challenging.
The US Transportation Department has recently released guidelines for driverless car makers. What do these guidelines cover, and are there any ideas that Australia can draw from this?
Oh yes, these guidelines are very timely. The submissions to the National Transport Commission, as I said, called for national leadership, and the guidelines are an example of national leadership from the US government. They essentially have four elements. It's quite simple. Part one is about standards and safety. Part two is about coordinating the control of driverless cars across the states and federally. And then there are two chapters about controls, how the national authority is going to manage controls, and how the national authority recommends that the states change their regulations in order to take control and management of these technologies. So a wonderful coordinated approach. And tucked in there in chapter one is a 15-step plan to raise and safety check autonomous vehicles, and it's a fabulous list that has very interesting elements that will be relevant to all regulators wanting to implement these vehicles.
The NTC consultation called for national leadership on the issue of driverless cars. What would that national leadership look like?
Look, it's a good question. If you go across Australia and you look at the different guidelines that are in place, the South Australians have made provision for trialling on the highway, and they're wanting to be accommodating to driverless cars. The Victorians have adopted the UK guidelines on testing driverless cars. I think the standard should really look like the standard that the US government has just proposed. In particular, it needs to address some of the complexities as to how data is going to be shared on trials, how the data about passengers is going to be protected and what options passengers will have. It needs to deal with things like how the car will resolve ethical questions in a crash situation. Does it protect the driver, or does it protect the people in other cars or on the sidewalk? How does it make that evaluation? That's going to need to be sort of one of the hard questions need to be addressed. There's questions of interface between the vehicles and the driver. Is there a steering wheel? Is there a brake? And also how the vehicle talks to people that are outside the car. Like if you've got humans driving other vehicles, what are the signals that an automated vehicle would make so that people on the footpath and other vehicles will know what the car's doing. There's the way we manage our standards and the way those standards are developed and tested. Part of the US standard is about making sure that everything is certified and making sure that systems which are upgraded are certified. There's another piece about how these vehicles are treated after an accident, and if they're allowed back on the road, have they certified all the sophisticated sensors and automation elements before they let it back in the public. So there's a whole lot to put out there, but it'd be great if all of the state governments and the federal government were approaching these questions in the same way and were coming up with a common standard for development of this in Australia.
In legislating for driverless technology, can Australia draw inspiration from other sectors, such as the use of autopilot in aviation?
I think there's a lot in common between aviation and autonomous cars. Certainly, the complexity of keeping an aeroplane in the air is not quite the same as keeping a car on the road, but when you take into account all of the kind of interactions that have to happen between different road signs and different road rules and speed limits, and people crossing the road and cyclists as well as motorcycles and so on, the complexity is very common. You have a very different scenario, though, that you're not going to have a trained pilot in control of the situation, and so making it a kind of technology for the people that can be implemented broadly and managed more broadly is going to have real complexity. I think the other thing that you'd take from the way that aeroplanes handle things is the approach that's going to happen to accidents. With autonomous vehicles on the road, the guidelines that are being released are already talking about the regulators wanting to have information feeds about what these vehicles are doing, how they're working, and when you have an accident, it's going to be like an aircraft accident. People will rush to see what happened, what went wrong, how do we adjust the technology, how do we change the human-technology interaction to ensure this doesn't happen again. So there's lots in common, but a lot that's quite different too.
How big a problem is the issue of cybersecurity for the rollout of driverless technology?
Well, it's a very interesting topic because in the middle of last year, there was a lead article in Wired magazine where these two hackers had managed to go in through the Wi-Fi on a normal family vehicle and take control of the safety systems and drive it off the road. In response to that article, the US Congress wrote to automakers and said, are you making your vehicles secure? And the report back was, well, actually, no. There hadn't been a lot of penetration testing done on vehicles. There wasn't a lot of thought about the hardening of the information systems. But in those standards that we're just talking about, a big part of it is sharing information between the vehicle manufacturers and the regulators, and also getting consent from the users about that information, who it's shared with, and giving users some control over the sharing of that information. And then there's just the automation of the vehicle itself requires connectivity between traffic lights and other parts of the road infrastructure so that the vehicle's maintained safely. All that connectivity presents enormous challenges for people designing the software and trying to secure it. And it's going to be an absolute priority for these vehicles. One of the things in the 15-point safety check in those US standards is that the US government wants to see every upgrade to car software for the purpose of certification, and that's one of the things that's been most controversial. The car makers are already saying, wait a second, we don't really want all our software upgrades to have to go through a bureaucratic process. A very important issue in this space.
As driverless technology becomes more prevalent, what are the broader implications?
Well, I was at a seminar earlier this year where somebody from Daimler stood up and said to the audience, how many people have cars? And about 80% put their hands up. And he said, well, how many of you drive your car more than 5% of the time? And hardly anybody put his hand up. And he said, well, the average car is on the road between 4 and 7% of its life. That's 1/20th of the life of the car actually being driven. If we can automate vehicles, that has a big impact on the need for cars and the need for cars being manufactured. And he was saying this is the biggest disruption to the motor vehicle industry since the invention of the car. So when you follow that through, and I'm not sure that 1/20th is exactly right, and people are asleep 1/3 of the time, and different ways of sharing will happen, which may in fact reduce the number of vehicles needed. But we won't need underground car parking, we won't need on-street car parking, we won't need a lot of space that's currently designated on private land for cars. The way that they're managed and they are stored when they're not being used will be different, and there'll be lots of cars moving around that are empty. And so, real issues for public safety and for control and for data management will be different. So I think a really different city and a really different road infrastructure, and a lot of economies and gains to be made, but also a lot of investment to be made in changes and new technology to get there.
When will we see driverless cars on our roads?
Well, there was a prediction I saw recently that said as many as 20% of vehicles will be automated by 2020. I think that prediction is a bit rich. It might happen in some markets, maybe in Singapore, but for other predictions have gone from 5 years to 15 years for substantial automation. And it's generally expected, I heard a car industry rep saying that they were expecting there to be more automated vehicles than human managed vehicles within 15 years. So this is a revolution which is really underway.